The grave sat on a hill just beyond the cottonwoods, the soil still unsettled, marked only by a wooden cross leaning against the wind. Mary Ellen knelt there each dawn, her black skirt soaked by dew, her hands pressed to the earth as if she could hold it down, as if the truth buried there might claw its way out. The townsfolk thought her grief was simple. A widow's mourning, a woman robbed of her husband by fever in the long winter. They pitied her in church, left baskets of bread at her door, and whispered prayers as she passed. But pity was easier when folks didn't know the truth, for Mary Ellen carried a secret that gnawed at her bones. The prairie wind seemed to know it too. It whistled low through the grass, rattled the bare branches, reminded her with every breath that nothing stayed hidden forever. Her husband, Thomas, had not died from fever. Not in the way folks believed. His death had been slower, crueler, tangled in lies and longing she could not confess. She had watched him weaken, not from illness, but from her silence, and when his eyes turned hollow, when his last breath slipped into the cold night, guilt pressed heavier than any coffin lid. She traced her fingers across the carved letters on the cross. Thomas McGraw, 1832–1864. The numbers were true. The words were not. Behind her, the sun rose over the plains, staining the horizon gold. The sound of hoofbeats carried faintly in the distance, a rhythm that stirred her chest. She knew the sound too well. Jonah Fletcher, the scout, the man whose shadow had crossed her doorway too often in Thomas's final months. Jonah was the kind of man women weren't supposed to look at twice. Tall, lean, with eyes dark as storm clouds and a scar that split his jawline. He had ridden the frontier since boyhood, guiding wagons through the wilderness, tracking outlaws for pay, carrying dust and danger wherever he went. But when Thomas had grown weak, it was Jonah who brought firewood, Jonah who fixed the roof, Jonah who sat at her table while the wind howled through the prairie nights. His presence had been warm, forbidden, and dangerous. She had never spoken her longing aloud, never let her hands linger too long on his. Yet the truth lived between them like a spark under dry grass, and Thomas had seen it. She knew he had. Mary Ellen rose from the grave, brushing dirt from her skirt, and turned toward the house. The cabin looked small against the wide horizon, its roof sagging, the fields around it bare. Inside, silence pressed heavy. Samuel's boots are still by the door, his Bible on the table, ghosts in every corner. She lit the stove, but her hands shook so badly she dropped the match. It wasn't grief that made her tremble. It was the memory of Jonah's eyes the night Thomas died. He had stood at her door, rain dripping from his hat, saying nothing, only staring at her with a sorrow she couldn't name. And in that silence, she knew. He carried part of her secret, too. By noon, the town came alive. Wagons rattled down Main Street. Children chased each other through the dust. Men leaned against saloon doors with cigarettes burning slowly. Mary Ellen walked among them with her basket, her face pale, her back straight, her secret sealed behind tight lips. But gossip moved faster than the wind in a town like this. She heard it in the way women hushed when she entered the store, in the way men glanced sideways as she passed. They didn't know the truth, not yet, but suspicion was a seed, and seeds took root in hungry soil. At the post office, she saw him, Jonah swinging down from his horse, dust rising around his boots. His coat was worn, his hat tilted low, but his presence turned every head. He nodded to her just once, but the look in his eyes lingered too long. Her breath caught. She gripped her basket tighter, and in that small pause the whispers sharpened. By evening she was back at the cabin, staring into the fire. The flames hissed, smoke curling toward the rafters, but her mind churned with voices. She thought of Thomas, his hand gripping hers as fever, or was it sorrow, took him. She thought of Jonah, the heat of his nearness when the world outside froze, and she thought of the lie that bound it all together, the lie that Thomas had died from fever, the lie she had sworn to carry to her grave. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters. The night stretched endless. She moved to the window, staring at the black horizon. For a moment she thought she saw a figure on horseback waiting in the distance, unmoving. She blinked, and it was gone. Still, she knew Jonah would return, he always did. And when he did, the secret she carried would bleed into the open. Secrets had a way of doing that in the Wild West. They lived in dust, in shadows, in the eyes of men who had seen too much. They could not stay buried forever, not even under the weight of a wooden cross. Mary Ellen pressed her forehead against the glass, her breath fogging the pain. Her chest ached with guilt, with longing, with fear. She whispered into the night, though no one could hear. I didn't mean for it to happen, but the words were hollow, lost to the prairie wind. Behind her, the fire popped, sending sparks into the dark. She closed her eyes, and in the silence she heard again the sound of hoofbeats. Slow, heavy, drawing closer. The secret she carried throbbed like a wound. And she knew, with every step of that horse, the day was coming when it would spill. The church bell rang at noon, its hollow clang rolling across the town like a warning. Folks stepped out of shops, heads lifting, hands shading their eyes. Dust hung heavy in the air, the kind that made every sound sharper, every silence meaner. Jonah Fletcher rode in slow from the north trail, his horse lathered, its sides streaked with foam. His coat was torn, his jaw split open where a fist had found him. But it was his boots that froze the crowd, dark, wet, splattered. Blood clung thick to the leather, dripping into the dust with each step of his horse. The whispers rose at once. A woman gasped, clutching her child close. Men stiffened, hands hovering near the butts of their pistols. The preacher stopped mid-step on the chapel stairs, his Bible lowering, his mouth tight. Jonah swung down from the saddle. His face carried the emptiness of a man too tired to lie. He didn't hide the blood, didn't wipe it off. He walked straight down the center of Main Street, each boot print leaving a mark redder than the earth. Whose blood? A man muttered from the boardwalk. Not his own, another replied. Jonah stopped outside the saloon, his hand gripping the hitching post as though he needed it to keep standing. His horse snorted, restless, its flanks streaked with crimson handprints. The sheriff arrived then, pushing through the crowd, his badge catching the sun. Conrad Harlow, broad-shouldered, gray-eyed, carrying the weight of justice like a man who had long ago stopped believing in it. He eyed Jonah, his voice low but firm. Tell me it ain't what it looks like. Jonah's jaw tightened. He didn't answer. The silence spoke louder than words. The crowd pressed closer, their whispers sharpening into something like anger. Blood was bad enough, but blood carried on the boots of a man like Jonah. Silent, brooding, always too near Mary Ellen's cabin. That was something worse. Who'd you kill? A voice called. Jonah lifted his eyes. For a moment, the storm inside them broke free. Pain, regret, rage, all tangled together. His lips parted, but no name came out. Only silence. Sheriff Conrad's hand brushed his holster. You'll come with me, Jonah, now. Jonah shook his head, slow, deliberate. Not yet, gasps rippled through the crowd. To defy the sheriff was to defy the law itself. But Jonah didn't flinch. His body swayed with exhaustion, his boots dripping crimson. But his voice carried steady. There's more to this than you think. Conrad's eyes narrowed. Then say it plain. But Jonah didn't. He turned toward the saloon, pushing through the doors, leaving streaks of blood across the wood. The doors swung shut, and for a moment the whole town seemed to hold its breath. Inside, the saloon reeked of smoke and whiskey. Men at the card tables froze, eyes wide, following the blood trail across the floor. Jonah staggered to the bar, ordered whiskey, and drank it down like water. Outside, the whispers turned to theories. It was Thomas's kin. No, it was a drifter. Man's always fighting with drifters. Maybe it was for her. That last whisper spread fastest. For her, Mary Ellen, the widow on the hill, the woman whose shawl trailed black in the church aisles. By dusk, the whole town believed it. Jonah had killed for love. Mary Ellen heard it first from a neighbor at her gate. She stood on the porch, the sunset burning orange behind her, while the words sank like stones. Jonah, blood on his boots. Killed her. Her hands trembled as she gripped the rail. She wanted to scream it wasn't true, that no man had died for her. But silence bound her throat. The memory of Jonah's eyes the night Thomas died bound her tighter. If she denied it, they'd still whisper. If she admitted it, the sheriff would string Jonah up before the next sunrise. She turned her face away, but the neighbor saw enough in her eyes. Enough to feed the story. Enough to carry it down Main Street until it reached every ear in town. That night the church bell rang again. Not for prayer. For warning, men gathered with rifles. Women drew shutters closed. Children whispered beneath quilts. And through it all, Mary Ellen sat by her fire, her face pale, her hands clenched. Jonah's boots had carried blood into town. Now the town wanted blood in return. And in her chest, the secret burned hotter. She knew whose blood it was. She knew why Jonah's silence held. But if she spoke it aloud, the truth would destroy them both. Outside, the prairie wind rose, carrying dust down the empty street. The gallows creaked as if it knew its time was coming. Jonah's boots sat heavy on the saloon floor. Mary Ellen's secret sat heavier still. And the town sharpened its knives on whispers. Sheriff Conrad Harlow rose before the sun, the way he always had. Years on the frontier had carved the habit deep. He stood at his window, staring at the prairie stretching endless and silent. The sky a pale wash of gray. His coffee went cold in his hand. Sleep never lasted long anymore. Not since the blood in Jonah Fletcher's boots had stained the town. By dawn, Conrad was in the street. Dust clung to his coat. The sound of spurs echoed sharp as he walked toward the saloon. The door creaked when he pushed it open, revealing the stale stench of whiskey, sweat, and smoke. Jonah sat alone at a corner table, his hat pulled low, shadows hiding his eyes. His boots still carried dried blood, his hands wrapped around a glass he hadn't touched. Conrad watched him for a long moment before stepping closer. "Mornin'." Jonah didn't look up. The sheriff slid into the chair across from him. His voice stayed steady, but his eyes never softened. "I need a name." Jonah's jaw tightened. Silence answered. Conrad leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "The town's restless. They'll hang you with or without me if this keeps up. But if you tell me who, maybe, just maybe, I can keep you alive." Jonah's gaze lifted at last. His eyes were dark, stormed with something heavier than guilt. "You think I don't know that? You think I don't hear him sharpening the rope every time I close my eyes?" Conrad's stare held. He'd seen men lie 100 times. Their eyes darted, their hands twitched, their voices wavered. But Jonah's eyes carried something else. Not the slick shine of a liar. Something more dangerous, truth buried. Conrad sat back. "This ain't just blood in your boots. This is a secret. And secrets rot faster than bodies in this town." Jonah's lips curved into something close to a bitter smile. "You'd know?" The words hit harder than a bullet. Conrad stiffened. He had buried plenty of truths in his years. Sins of his own, sins of the town. But to hear it thrown at him now from Jonah of all men sparked a fire behind his ribs. "Careful," Conrad warned. Jonah lifted his glass, still full, and set it down again. "You smell lies the same as I do. You know whose secret this is. Ain't mine alone." The sheriff said nothing, but his mind turned at once to Mary Ellen, the widow with eyes too haunted for a woman her age. The widow who walked to the grave every dawn, as though she feared what might crawl out of it. The memory of her standing in the square flashed in his mind, the way she looked at Jonah, her hands trembling on the basket. That silence of hers was heavier than any denial. Conrad rose from the table. His chair scraped the floor, sharp in the quiet saloon. Jonah didn't move, didn't flinch, just watched him with the hollow patience of a man waiting for the end. Outside, the town had already woken. Men leaned against posts, eyes following the sheriff. Women whispered on boardwalks, their skirts brushing the dust. The air itself carried suspicion. Conrad walked slowly down Main Street, his boots stirring the silence. He saw it in every face, the hunger for answers, the hunger for blood. And beneath it, fear, the kind of fear that made men violent, made crowds into mobs. At the church, the preacher stopped him. "Sheriff, folks need to know. Justice ain't justice if it's delayed." Conrad tipped his hat, his voice flat. Justice is truth, not rumor. But even as he said it, doubt pressed heavy. Because he smelled it plain. The whole town was thick with lies. Lies clung to the dust, to the whispers, to the silence between Jonah and Mary Ellen. By evening, Conrad found himself on her porch. The sun sank low, bleeding gold across the fields. The cabin stood small, lonely against the wide horizon. He knocked once, and Mary Ellen opened the door slowly, her face pale in the light. "Sheriff," she said, voice soft. "Evenin'," he answered. He tipped his hat, but his eyes stayed sharp. "We need to talk." She stepped aside. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and sorrow. The table was set for one, bread left untouched. A shawl hung by the chair, worn thin. Conrad stayed standing, his hat in his hand. "You know what folks are saying." Her hands gripped the back of the chair. "I don't listen to whispers." He studied her. The way her shoulders tensed, the way her eyes avoided him. Lies had a smell, the same as dust after rain. He smelled them now. "Have you seen Jonah lately?" he asked, her breath caught. A pause too long, then no. The lie rang clear as a church bell. Conrad's jaw tightened. He could press her, force it out, but he saw the fear in her eyes. Not afraid of him. Fear of herself. "Be careful, Mary Ellen," he said finally. His voice dropped low, almost tender. "Secrets don't stay buried long out here." She didn't answer. Only gripped the chair tighter, her knuckles white. Conrad stepped back to the door. The sun had nearly dropped, the sky painted red. He set his hat on his head, his voice steady as he left. And lies. Lies always come due. The door closed behind him. Mary Ellen stood in the quiet, her chest heaving. Her secret throbbed in the silence. She pressed her hand to her lips as if to hold it in. But outside, Sheriff Conrad walked through the dust. His gut heavy with truth, he couldn't yet speak. He smelled it in the air, in the streets, in the way the town looked at Jonah. Blood was only half the story. Lies made up the rest, and Conrad knew both were about to drown the town. The saloon was thick with smoke that night, lantern light flickering across warped wooden walls. Cards slapped against tables, dice rattled in cups, glasses clinked. But beneath the noise ran a current sharper than whiskey. Whispers low and dangerous, winding from mouth to mouth like snakes. Jonah Fletcher sat in the corner, hat low, whiskey untouched. His boots still bore faint stains, dark against the worn leather. Men eyed them when they thought he wasn't looking. Blood, even dried, never let a man walk in peace. Near the bar, a group of ranch hands leaned close over their cards. Their voices were hushed, but the words carried just enough. "Killed a man for her," they say. "The widow on the hill? Ain't no other her worth killing for." Laughter followed, bitter and sharp. One man spat into the sawdust. "Always knew that woman carried something she didn't speak." Jonah's jaw tightened, his hand twitching near the glass. He didn't rise, didn't speak, but every muscle in his body coiled tight. He heard each word, the way men always did when gossip sharpened against their name. At another table, older men smoked in silence, but their eyes never left Jonah. Judgment hung heavy in their gaze. They'd seen towns torn apart by whispers before, seen men strung up not by law but by rumor. The piano clanged off-key as if even the music was uneasy. Then a voice too loud, too drunk, cracked the tension. Sheriff ought to string him up right now. "Save us all the trouble." The room stilled. Jonah lifted his head, his eyes dark under the brim of his hat. For a moment no one moved. Then he rose, slow, steady, the scrape of his chair cutting through the smoke. The drunk froze, his face paling, but Jonah didn't reach for his gun. He only stared, the kind of stare that burned hotter than a bullet. Finally the man looked away, muttering into his drink. The whispers didn't stop. They grew sharper, hungrier, words of betrayal, words of vengeance. By midnight the saloon felt like a tinderbox. Every glance, every shuffle of boots threatened to spark it. Sheriff Conrad arrived then, his spurs cutting through the noise. He stepped inside, scanning the room, eyes landing on Jonah. For a heartbeat, the two men stared at each other, sheriff and scout, law and outlaw, truth and silence. Conrad moved to the bar, his voice steady. "Everyone here best remembers the law still stands." But even he knew his words carried little weight. In a town drowning in rumor, the law was just another whisper. Jonah left soon after, pushing through the swinging doors. The night air hit him cool and sharp. The sky above spread wide, stars burning cold. His boots thudded against the dust, each step heavy with the weight of words he hadn't spoken. From the shadows, voices drifted still. "She's protecting him. Widow's in too deep. She'll hang right beside him if it comes to it." Jonah stopped at the end of the street, his fists clenched. He wanted to shout it down, to tear truth from lies. But the truth itself was poison, and if it spilled, Mary Ellen would drown first. So he walked into the dark, the town's whispers chasing him like wolves. Back in the saloon, the talk turned meaner. Ben leaned closer, liquor loosening tongues. "Remember Thomas McGraw? Died too sudden, if you ask me." "A fever," they said. "Fever, don't leave a widow with eyes like that." The laughter that followed was sharp, cruel, but under it lay fear. The kind of fear that made men dangerous, that made mobs rise before dawn. Conrad listened, silent, his jaw set. He didn't stop talking. He couldn't. Gossip was quicker than bullets. By the time the lamps burned low and the last hands of cards were dealt, the saloon carried a decision heavier than law. The town had chosen its story, and stories once chosen had a way of becoming truth. That night, Mary Ellen sat by her fire, the wind howling outside. She heard none of the whispers, but she felt them all the same. The prairie carried voices farther than men thought. She knew her name was in their mouths. She pressed her hands to her face, whispering prayers that broke before they left her lips. Jonah carried blood in his boots. She carried it in her soul. And in the saloon, men sharpened their words into weapons. The town was no longer asking what had happened. It was deciding what it would do. The night pressed heavy against the cabin walls. The prairie wind rattled the shutters, carrying with it the low cry of coyotes far out in the dark. Mary Ellen sat by the fire, her shawl pulled close, the flames throwing shadows that swayed across the floor. Sleep would not come. It hadn't for weeks. She tried to read her husband's Bible, the one that still smelled faintly of tobacco and dust, but the words blurred before her eyes. Every verse cut sharp, reminding her of sin, of secrets, of promises broken. She closed it at last and set it aside, her hands trembling. Then came the sound. Boots, heavy, hurried, pounding the porch outside. Her heart leapt, blood rushing loud in her ears. She froze, breath shallow, staring at the door. The knock came a moment later, sharp, desperate, too urgent for any neighbor. She rose, her body moving as if against her will, and gripped the lantern from the table. The flame flickered, casting her face in trembling light. She stepped toward the door, her pulse hammering. Mary Ellen, his voice. Low, ragged, breaking through the wood. Jonah, her breath caught. She stood frozen, hand on the latch, torn between opening it and barring it forever. But his next words split her heart. "They're coming for me," the latch clicked. The door creaked open. And there he was, hat gone, hair wild, coat torn. Dirt smeared across his face. His eyes burned in the lantern glow, haunted, pleading. "They'll hang me by dawn if you don't choose," he rasped. "I can't run alone." Her knees weakened. She leaned against the frame, gripping it tight. "Jonah, you shouldn't be here. I had no place else." His hand pressed against the door, close to hers, trembling. "Say the word and I'll ride on. But if you want me to stay, if you want me to fight, I'll do it." "For you," tears stung her eyes. The fire behind her hissed, throwing sparks, as if it too knew the danger in his words. "You killed me," she whispered. His jaw tightened. "I killed because I had no choice. But I'd face hell itself if it meant keeping you safe." Her chest ached with something she could not name. Longing, guilt, terror, all wound together. The memory of Thomas's grave pressed heavy, yet Jonah's eyes pulled her closer, like a flame pulling a moth. A shout echoed faintly in the distance. Boots in the dirt. Men's voices, rough and angry, drifting on the wind. Jonah's hand gripped her arm, fierce. "They're coming." Decide now, her breath shook. She saw it plain, the rope already tied, the gallows waiting in the square. She saw Jonah's body swaying, the crowd roaring for blood. Her heart screamed no, but her mind whispered of Thomas, of vows spoken, of sins unspoken. "You should go," she said, though her voice cracked. "Run, don't make me watch." Jonah's eyes searched hers, desperate. "Is that truly what you want?" She couldn't answer. Her silence was enough. His hand fell away. His shoulders sagged. For a moment he looked less outlaw than a broken man, stripped bare of all but sorrow. The voices outside grew louder. Lanterns bobbed in the distance, men shouting, rifles clattering. Jonah pulled his coat tight. "Then this is goodbye." Her throat closed. She wanted to reach for him, to beg him to stay, but her body betrayed her. She stood rigid, her hand trembling on the door. He stepped into the night, his boots thudding against the porch. The lantern light caught his face one last time. His lips parted as if to speak her name, but no sound came. Then he was gone, swallowed by the dark. The shouts drew nearer. A dog barked, sharp and frantic. Mary Ellen pressed the door shut, leaning against it, her chest heaving. Inside, the fire hissed low, embers glowing red. She sank into Samuel's chair, burying her face in her hands. Tears came hot and fast, choking her, shaking her shoulders. She whispered Jonah's name into her palms. A confession no one could hear. Outside, hooves thundered past. Men shouted. The chase was on. Mary Ellen sat trembling, knowing she had chosen nothing and everything all at once, knowing her silence had damned them both. When the night finally quieted, when only the coyotes cried again across the prairie, she lifted her head. The fire had nearly died. The house was dark, the silence heavy, but in the distance, faint and fleeting, she thought she heard a single gunshot crack the night. Her heart stopped. She stumbled to the window, pressing her face to the glass, searching the black horizon. Nothing, only wind, only stars, only silence. Her breath came ragged. Her hands trembled against the sill. The secret inside her throbbed, louder than ever. She knew the town would not rest now. They would hunt until Jonah was found, and when he was, the rope would follow. Mary Ellen turned from the window, her face wet with tears. She fell to her knees by the fire, whispering prayers that tangled into sobs, but she knew no prayer could undo what had begun. Tonight she could not run from it, and neither could he. Morning broke hard and unforgiving. The sun climbed slowly over the prairie, spilling golden light across a town already awake with tension. Dust hung heavy in the air, stirred by boots gathering in the square. The gallows stood at the center, its beams dark against the sky, the rope swaying gently as if the wind itself were impatient. Mary Ellen walked among the crowd, her shawl pulled tight, her face pale but set. Every step felt like walking into a grave. Whispers followed her, sharp, cutting, merciless. Widow, sinner, murderess. She heard them all, but she kept her eyes fixed on the gallows. Then the jailhouse door creaked open. Jonah Fletcher stepped out, wrists bound, his coat torn, his face marked by sleepless nights and bruises. Yet he walked steady, his boots striking the dirt with the same rhythm that had haunted her dreams. The crowd hushed, their anger a living thing waiting to burst. Mothers pulled children closer. Men spat into the dust. The preacher clutched his Bible tight. Sheriff Conrad walked beside Jonah, jaw clenched, eyes forward. His hand gripped Jonah's arm, but his expression carried more torment than justice. When Jonah reached the platform, he lifted his head. His eyes found Mary Ellen at once, cutting through the sea of faces, binding her where she stood. She gasped, her throat tight, her hands trembling against her shawl. The preacher stepped forward, voice rising above the silence. Jonah Fletcher, you stand condemned by law and by the blood of this town. Your sins cry out for judgment. Jonah said nothing. His gaze never left Mary Ellen. Conrad placed him beneath the rope. The noose dangled inches from his head. The crowd shifted, restless, eager for the moment. The wood of the platform groaned under the weight of bodies and expectation alike. Mary Ellen felt her chest cave in. She pushed forward, her voice breaking the silence. No! All heads turned. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The preacher faltered, his Bible lowering. Conrad froze, his hand on the rope. Mary Ellen's voice rose again, raw and ragged. You can't take him. You can't. The crowd erupted. Shouts of outrage, curses, threats. Men barked for justice, women hissed her name like poison. But Mary Ellen did not waver. She climbed the steps, her skirts dragging, her heart hammering. She reached Jonah's side, her hand trembling as it brushed his arm. Tears blurred her vision. I can't let you go like this. Jonah's eyes softened, his voice low, meant only for her. You should. You'll damn yourself. I'm already damned, she whispered. The sheriff's voice cut sharp. Mary Ellen, step down. She shook her head, gripping Jonah's arm tighter. Her voice cracked but carried. If you kill him, you kill me too. The crowd roared in anger, fists raised, boots stomping. The platform shook beneath them. Conrad's face twisted, torn between duty and despair. Jonah leaned close, his breath warm, his words steady despite the noose waiting above. Don't do this, but she did. Her lips found his. It was not a kiss of passion. It was a kiss of defiance, of sorrow, of love too late to save. The crowd gasped, the square split by shock and fury. Whispers turned to shouts, shouts to chaos. Conrad's hand tightened on the lever. His eyes burned with pain. He looked at Mary Ellen, at Jonah, at the crowd that demanded blood. His jaw clenched. Jonah pulled back just enough to whisper, "Let it end." Mary Ellen shook her head, sobbing. "No?" "Yes," he breathed. "Better me than you." Conrad closed his eyes. And then the lever fell. The crack of wood split the morning. The rope snapped taut. The crowd roared. Mary Ellen's scream tore the sky. She clutched Jonah's body as it swung, her sobs breaking into the air, raw and merciless. The preacher dropped his Bible. Mothers shielded their children and looked away, their fury dimmed by the sight of grief too sharp to witness. Conrad stood rigid, his face ashen. The badge on his chest gleamed in the sun, but it felt heavier than iron. He had upheld the law, but the cost burned deeper than sin. Mary Ellen collapsed to her knees, her shawl falling, her hair wild. She whispered Jonah's name again and again, as though it might bring him back, as though it might undo the world. The rope creaked. The crowd dispersed, their hunger sated, their whispers already shifting into legend. By noon, the square was nearly empty. Only the gallows remained, and Mary Ellen beneath it, her hands pressed to the dirt, her face streaked with tears. Sheriff Conrad lingered at the edge, his shadow long in the sun. He wanted to speak, to offer comfort, but the weight of his silence pressed him still. He turned at last, walking away, his boots dragging through the dust. Mary Ellen lifted her head, her voice hoarse, breaking against the empty air. "If you spared him," she whispered, "I'd have hated you forever." Her eyes closed, tears spilling anew. "But now I hate myself." The rope swayed in the breeze. The sun burned on, merciless, and the prairie wind carried her cry far across the land, a sound that would haunt every ear it touched. The widow, the scout, the sheriff, bound together by love, by blood, by silence. Their story etched not in stone, but in dust and sorrow. And when the wind died, only the creak of the gallows remained.